Thank you so much, Jorge. And I'm hoping that I will just presume that everyone can hear me fine, unless I notice in the chat that some of the audio isn't working. It feels a little bit like coming home to present here at Starts today. I'm currently a social work academic, as Jorge said. I'm a professor of social work at CQ University in Sydney. And I'd also like to do a little shout out because I can see some of my wonderful Masters of Social Work students in the room here today. So thank you for accepting that invitation to come along. I was initially on a interdisciplinary working group with Starts back in the early 2000s, so it's lovely to be able to speak here today. And to reflect on the fact that I started as a frontline social worker in the 1990s and then moved into the research space to really better understand the ways in which we support people living with a traumatic loss, with an emphasis on working with families of missing people, but not just in the context of crime-related disappearance or Australian context of missing people, but working with Red Cross, International Social Services, STARTS, and other community organisations around refugee trauma, displacement, and other lived experiences of unresolved losses. Like Jorge did, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal Wangal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land that I'm joining you from today. I pay my respect to elders past, present, and future, and respect any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the room with us today. I recognise their enduring connection to local lands and waters and their overrepresentation in missing persons statistics, both in relation to police, but stolen generation and out of home care. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Today, I want to talk to you about something that sits really closely at the heart of the work that many of you do, and many of the different interests in terms of people reflecting in the chat about where they're coming from today, where they're joining, and the names of the organisations that they work with. I think one of the important parts, and Jorge reflected that in my bio, is about centering the fact that both the work that we do needs to be recognised in terms of the ways in which we support people, but also that impact on ourselves. And so making sure that we extend that same compassion and empathy to the work that we attempt to do. Because as much as I love being a social worker, I think being a social worker has changed who I am, and always recognizing my role in terms of my own reflexivity to do really important compassion, culturally focused work needs to be at the forefront of some of our discussions. Today, I'm really aiming to reflect on the work that I've done to better understand the ways in which people live alongside an ambiguous loss. That's a loss that doesn't have a clear ending. And that can be in the context of someone being missing, when a family member is displaced, or when a loved one is lost to conflict or trauma. What I've come to understand over almost the last 30 years is really that the traditional loss frameworks that we use, they simply don't understand the type of grief that we respond to. And in some cases, they actually make those grief responses more difficult because of the ways in which people respond, the off-the-cuff comments that they make, or their suggestions about strategies of moving on or moving forward. Farhan is going to speak after me today. And I think what's really important is that my focus is exploring the broader academic literature and my reflections as a professor for him to be able to then go on and speak about those individual, culturally focused lived experience reflections. We have called this talk Hope and Heartache, and what I mean by that is a wish or a desire to give voice to the liminal space. The space between where people exist and where they don't know if their loved one is alive or dead, or where they've been forced from their home but don't know if they'll ever return. When trauma has fractured their world and healing feels impossible, this is the liminal space. And it's where many people live, but we fail to acknowledge it across the community. So, part of the way in which I talk and part of the work that I do is really understanding the ways in which we define the experiences of what we live through. A lot of that is about starting to unpack the definitions of an ambiguous loss so that we can make sure that all of us here today talking can connect with those suggestions. Ambiguous loss is a phrase that was coined by Emeritus Professor Pauline Boss, who's an American theorist, and that happened in the late 70s, following her work with soldiers missing in action. Pauline is now in her 92nd year and still works as both my research mentor and friend. So Pauline Boss's work really became from that central place of working with soldiers missing in action and being able to name the lived experience of people who were left behind. That work really centered on the fact that we need to better respond to people where a loss isn't final, whatever that means. Pauline Boss identified two terms, which I've put up on the slides here today, of ambiguous loss. And that first is very much the physical ambiguity when a person is absent, but psychologically present. So a sense of not knowing where somebody's body is, but still feeling very much connected without any certainty as to whether or not they're going to come back. The person is gone, but there's no proof of death. They're absent, but they're held in the family's mind as potentially alive. They're gone, but not for sure. The second type, which would be for another conversation, is that psychological ambiguity, where a person is present, but psychologically absent. We might see that sometimes as health professionals working with people experiencing dementia, someone living with severe mental ill health, someone who's been so traumatized that they've emotionally withdrawn from their usual ways in which they seek support. But the older I've gotten and the more work I've done and the more that I've traveled around the world talking about ambiguous loss, I also think that there's a third type that's particularly relevant for the conversation here today. And that's about collective or community ambiguous loss. That very Western approach to understanding grief very much talks to the individual response to something happening. We talk about a loss being experienced by a person rather than a loss being experienced by a community. I think that when we're talking about traumatic losses on large scales in relation to war and disconnection, that people who are displaced by conflict or those that have lost their homeland or their culture, we really need to understand the ways in which those ripple effects within communities are also examples of ambiguous loss on a larger scale. I'm just going to move forwards. One more slide. Okay. So part of that really is about understanding the concept of liminality. So when I talk about liminality, first of all, it's a word that I love saying. I feel like it rolls around your mouth quite nicely, is that it really speaks to that space that I've understood working with families experiencing an ambiguous loss. So what do I mean by a liminal space? It's a space of in-betweenness, of ambiguity, a threshold of what has happened and what might be. Some people have described it in research interviews I've conducted as almost a waiting room of uncertainty. But I think that the mistake sometimes we think about in those in-between areas is that we view them as transitions from one place to the next. But when working with families experiencing ambiguous loss for long periods of time, it becomes not a waiting room, but a place that people have to learn to exist. When someone has experienced those life-challenging events, the liminal space of who they were before and who they might become is really interrogating what it means to exist in those spaces. Liminal spaces are not temporary. They're not spaces that people work through on their way to, as we like to call it, acceptance or closure. For many people, it becomes a permanent feature of their lives. And I think one of the failings that we've often provided as people who provide support is that we need to meet people where they're at in these liminal spaces. That the role is about assisting people to learn to live with it, to develop strategies to survive in it. And our capacity as people offering support is to help them do that, not to push people towards closure or acceptance, but to recognize that building a life around uncertainty is some of the only ways that we can honor their loss. One of the things that I was particularly struck with is that as a researcher working through the COVID-19 pandemic, is that we all got a sense of what it feels like to live with uncertainty. I think it's a very privileged position for a lot of people to say during the pandemic that they did never experience that sense before of being caught between the life they had versus the life that they wanted to get back to. But I do think that that collective experience gave us a sense of what it means to be deeply uncomfortable. And I think that for some people in the broader community that have been lucky enough to sometimes not have to be exposed to particular types of trauma, is that they get that sense of what it means to want to escape something, to have the information that they need in order to move forward. So, if the uncertainty is the reality, what does it mean to live like this in the space of hope? So, as Farhan and I are talking about today, we do want to explore the ways in which hope and heartache can coexist with each other. My whole PhD, almost 15 years ago now, really interrogated the concept of hope in the field of ambiguity. Because for so many of the people that I worked with, they talked a lot about the fact that people told them to hold on to hope, to not give up their hope, or conversely, to let go of their hope if people viewed that the hope had been held on to for too long. Hope doesn't disappear over time. It changes, it shifts, it becomes more nuanced. People talk about the feelings of both hopefulness and hopelessness in their hope for the return of a loved one. But often as time goes past, irrespective of the circumstance in which someone disappears, people learn that hope has to transform along that pathway. That in the beginning, it is about hope for bringing that person back and having them in their full form. For some, it can be hope for information or hope for answers. On some days, it's hope for the capacity to survive the next hour or the next night, hope for their own well-being, hope for learning to survive what happens if they never found out what happened to somebody. And those broader concepts of hope for justice, hope for legal capacity to be able to get the answers that people need, for community recognition that their loss has even occurred. One of the mums that I worked with prior to my PhD and throughout talked to me about the loss of her daughter, who at that stage had been missing for 23 years. She talked about the fact that hope was taunting to her, that she wanted to hold on to hope because she felt she had to do that for her daughter until all of the evidence provided to her said that her daughter wasn't coming home. That sense of being a mother and not being able to give up on her daughter was the space that she wanted people to acknowledge, not whether or not they viewed that as realistic hope for her to hold on to. Hope in that liminal space is not the same as false hope. It's not about denying reality. It's not for support people to move people through those spaces to acceptance, but about saying to them, I don't know what's going to happen next, and I'm going to help build a life around it anyways. From a refugee perspective, with the work that I originally did in the early days of my social work career, it was very much a sense of, I don't know if I'll ever return home and I'm going to build a life here. I don't know if my loved one's going to be found and I'm going to find ways to honour their memory and to try and live fully. This is the kind of hope that sustains people in liminal spaces. And I'd really encourage you to really reflect on how you view hope in the context of loss, where it needs to be a passive, not an active grounding in the values that you have as professionals or as people with lived experience. So before I move over to Farhan in the next 10 minutes or so, I really wanted to leave you with not a snapshot of ideas. I think sometimes we can accidentally consider when we work in complexity that we just want someone to give us 5 top tips of how to move forwards. But I've had the honour over the last year of writing a book about my research reflections in order to better enhance the ways that we teach social workers, psychologists, support workers, community workers, because it's missing from our curriculums a lot of the time. We have this binary view that death is the only loss that needs to be validated. Yet all of those traumatic losses that happen in our community need to have names to them. So this is what I've kind of pulled from in terms of that deep work that I've been doing. The most important thing that I see for people is the power of naming the loss. That's not us as professionals telling people what they're living through, but giving them the tools to understand what is the other research that exists? How do we name this? Whether we think of it as an ambiguous loss or a disenfranchised grief or a living loss, we validate the person's experience because we say what you're feeling is real. What you are living through has a name, and you're not alone in this, despite the fact that most of our community in Australia has very limited understanding of this complexity. Many of the people that you work with will have experienced losses that society doesn't recognise. I think that what I've always witnessed from afar and in working with international students and domestic students in social work is that we need to honour the fact that when working in refugee communities, we need to name not just the losses of individuals, but loss of homeland, loss of culture, loss of sense of belonging. I think I see so many people try to reduce loss in terms of saying, but you're safe now, you're here, you should be grateful. When people experience torture and trauma, we send the message of, but you've survived, you should be healing. When the family member of a missing person talks about their loss, we suggest to them unintentionally or intentionally that they should move on, that they should accept that somebody's gone and not going to come back. Our job is to break that silence and to say your loss is real, it's valid, and let's talk about it. And that segues really nicely to the concept, which isn't a new concept, but it's always a good reminder of both and thinking. Now, this was explored in that work by Pauline Boss, but it's about holding seemingly two contradictory truths at the same time. That a person can be grateful for their safety and grieve the loss of their home at the same time. That people can work towards healing and still remain traumatized. That people can hope for the return or the location of someone and prepare for the possibility that they might never come back. We need to move away from the idea that you're either grieving or moving on. The liminal space is about fluctuating between the two. Third is very much around the people that work in this space. Because a lot of the time when I initially started working in missing persons, I had to challenge myself about the need to want to swoop in, to want to problem solve, to think up ideas, to reach out and hope that family tracing services, that the Red Cross, that other areas would be able to come up with the solution to the problem. But our job is not to fix the situation, it's to sit with the person and say, actually, I don't know what's going to happen either, but I'm here for you while we try and figure that out. The other part that I think really lends itself nicely, and I say this as a social worker, it lends itself very well to social work practice, is recognizing the importance of practical support alongside emotional and therapeutic support. So many times I see when traumatic events happened, the time delay between the event and people saying, we've sent counsellors to the area to talk to people. We need to recognise that a lot of people are looking for not just space to talk about the phenomenon of what they're living through, but the practical impacts of housing and education and employment, of medical care, of legal advocacy, of rebuilding their life. I think that we need to challenge the services that have a mindset that it's just about psychological support and recognise that the two are very closely connected to each other. And the last one is about building community and connection. I think one of the most damaging aspects that I've often seen in working with hundreds of families experiencing ambiguous loss is the isolation that it creates. I felt very early on that I almost felt like a bit of like I was an app in itself, that I was connecting people to others because I'd hear their stories, I'd recognize their similarities, and I'd connect them to each other. Families living through ambiguous losses often feel invisible. People feel disconnected from their culture, from their origin, sometimes from their new community. People feel alone in what they're navigating, and our job is to help people find that connection. I think that when we say to people there's a community here that might have been invisible to you before, we acknowledge that there are other people with lived experience, and I think that that can be incredibly powerful. So, in finishing up today, obviously I've provided my email address. I know that not everyone likes to share reflections in chats or might want to go away and think about some different ideas or seek out some research that they'd like me to gather for them and send on. Is that I think when you work with people living in some of the most difficult spaces imaginable, that we have to understand that loss without closure or trauma without resolution or displacement without certainty as to what's going to happen next is often met with the sense of a lot of people that, despite that, they are still surviving. They're building lives, they're finding meaning, they're maintaining hope in the way that they define hope. I think that it's really important for all of us, irrespective of what career stage we're at or what reflections we have, is that we recognize it's not our job to rescue people from the liminal space. Our job is to help to allow people, and I don't mean from a power perspective, but help people to learn to live with dignity, with agency, with connection to others, and the possibility of a meaningful future. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak here today. I'll be sticking around for questions at the end. But I think it's really encouraging for me, who has been pushing the kind of focus of ambiguous loss over the years and the need for greater awareness in the community, that finally the community is asking, and I'm noticing in traditional media as well, that we're getting better at naming this type of loss rather than thinking it doesn't exist. So I'll hand back over to you, Jorge, and over to Farhan. Thank you.